These are 7 of my best tips for controller players, and yes, these tips will apply to all the different skill levels in Apex Legends. So let's get into it. Number 1. Don't be fooled by advanced look controls. ALC is an advanced sensitivity that controller players can utilize, and it allows for a lot of fine tuning. You're able to slow down or speed up specific aspects of your sensitivity. Now, all sorts of creators love to claim that they found the best sensitivity in the world, and they're usually just showing a version of advanced look controls that may or may not even work for them. For the broad majority of players watching those videos, copying their ALCs might work, but most likely it will not. I've coached hundreds of players on controller and can tell you the majority of players who are on ALC are missing shots that they otherwise wouldn't be if they were on a more standard sensitivity like 4.4, 5.4, or 4.3. In my experience, I've also often seen how ALC will result in diminishing returns. It generally minimizes aim assist in exchange for maybe a faster sensitivity in some other areas. And this isn't what the majority of controller players are going to want or need, because a medium to slower sensitivity is generally better, and that's because aim assist tends to work a bit better if it's on the slower side. Think about lining up a target that's moving left to right at a fast pace. It's going to be harder to compensate that target on a faster sensitivity, as we are just using joysticks controlled by our thumbs. It will be common to either be too far ahead or too far behind that target, and this is kind of why aim assist exists in the first place. Now, to be clear here, this is just my opinion and the data that I've seen. If you play on ALC or you use a fast sensitivity and you're doing well, then by all means keep doing your thing. I'm just speaking in broad terms here for what I know will apply to the majority of players watching this. And another thing, you can go look up what the top pros use who are in the ALGS and see that the majority of them, in fact, do not use advanced look controls. Tip number 2, focus on looting quickly. As controller players, we can't really move and loot. Certainly nothing like what mouse and keyboard players can do. So we need to remember where things are when we're in death boxes and learn to grab it fast. If you're going for a quick armor swap, it's really important to have that muscle memory of how far down in the death box it is so that you're able to get it and be out. This carries over for everything else you may need in a death box from moment to moment. And I always encourage players to remember where shield batteries are so that they know where to grab them. Don't always be looking from top to bottom. Look for the things that you know you need and be a bit paranoid about how long you're standing still in that death box. More advanced players will learn to incorporate a jump and or a crouch while looting in the death boxes. This is important to use from time to time. Pressing jump right before you press X or whatever button you interact with is what will allow you to jump as you enter the death box. This technique is not easy to do at first, but over time it will prove to be a solid asset in your repertoire. Crouching, as I said, can also be done, but only once you're already in the death box, and it won't be as big of a deterrent for avoiding damage, but it can still prove to be helpful at times. In order to pull these things off, an important setting you're going to want to change to assist with this is taking damage closes death box menu. You want this off. And this will make it so that when you're in a crafter or a death box, you will be able to keep looting and grab that armor swap, even if it means you're taking an extra 50 damage. You don't want the game deciding this for themselves, because this will just create more problems for you. Tip number 3, find the right button layout. Now, personally, I use button puncher, and I recommend it for any player who holds a controller normally. I do understand that this layout can be fairly limiting if you hold the controller differently or you use paddles. Now, one of the main reasons why button puncher works so well is because it makes slide jumping way easier to do, and it also won't make you melee on accident as much. If you use a different button layout and it works, great, more power to you. But the key here is generally you're going to want to get off the default layout that the game puts you on. And while you're changing that around, I also recommend putting crouch on toggle if you don't use paddles. This way it'll be bound to your right stick and you'll be able to crouch up and down while you are still able to control your right joystick to aim with. Now, if you do use a controller with paddles, then personally I would bind one of the paddles to crouch and make sure that it's on hold, so that way it feels a bit more natural to just let go or press in the paddle when you want to crouch or come back up. If you're enjoying this video, all I ask in return is for you to hit the subscribe button. It's free and I'm getting super close to 100,000 subscribers. I also rarely ask for people to do this, but I know that if I do ask, most of you who've been meaning to hit that button will finally click it. So thank you for doing so. Number 4, learn to control the recoil patterns of most weapons. If you constantly practice with the weapons, you will not only get a good feel for the gun's recoil, but as a byproduct, you will be able to control it better. Now, most of the guns in Apex will require you to pull down on the joystick in a specific direction, either slightly left or right, or sometimes both. This will take some time, but I recommend going into the firing range to use these weapons without any attachments and really get a feel for the gun's recoil. The better of attachments you have on the gun, the less the recoil will be. The goal for every player should be to master the gun with no attachments so that they aren't as affected in game when they don't have the greatest loot. It's important you get this stuff down because Apex doesn't have bloom, and bloom is where recoil patterns will be randomized game to game. The more familiar you become with the weapon's recoil, the more proficient you will be while using it. Simple concept. But there's also something called recoil smoothing, which essentially can remove or severely mitigate the recoil of the weapons if you are strafing while shooting. You'll need to be moving left or right, but this will work for most guns up to a 70-meter range. It's an extremely solid way to learn how to incorporate some movement while shooting, but simultaneously reducing the recoil of those certain guns. I think a lot of players who don't know about recoil smoothing or about controlling recoil patterns in general struggle when they see content creators and it seems like they have no recoil whatsoever. I can tell you that Apex has a ton of skill gaps, and this right here is one of them. Tip number 5, fast and flashy movement isn't going to make you a better player. Well, at least not in the beginning. Look, if you're on controller, there's certainly some things you can learn from mouse and keyboard players, but it's important to remember you are not on mouse and keyboard, so you don't want to try to completely emulate your game after theirs. Ultimately, I'm talking about finding a middle ground here. You obviously want to incorporate some of the more important movement tech that all good players use, but don't be confused with how fast a mouse and keyboard player may be able to look around in order to pull off these techniques. As I said before, slower is generally better, but the bottom line here is that there's a trade-off when it comes to inputs in Apex. They both have their pros and cons, and every player can find success with either one. Controller is generally better for up-close fights because of aim assist, but it's hindered when it comes to certain movement tech, looting, and certain medium to long-range engagements. If you focus on getting a good understanding of sliding, jumping, climbing, using zip lines, and wall bouncing, well, these will be the core mechanics that you will most commonly use. Tip number 6, I want to talk about some settings that I think you must change. First off is the menu cursor speed. I put this around the halfway mark, but you could go a little bit higher. This will help you scroll faster while you're in death boxes, and it will also help you navigate your backpack much faster. Second is you want to turn auto sprint on. This will result in less wear and tear on your left stick, and it will also make for a smoother sprint. Third is going to be you want to raise your FOV, your field of view. The game is going to put you on 70 when you begin. Now, a lot of you have probably changed it since then, but I recommend going as high as 110 or at the very least 100. I play on 110, but this is going to severely help with your peripheral vision. And then the last one isn't a must change, but if you have an heirloom or you want to be able to inspect your weapons, turn survival slot off. This way, when you press left on the D-pad, you will go back to inspecting your weapon, fists, or heirloom. And if you have a heat shield or a mobile respawn beacon, you can just click start and then click it from your backpack. It's not as convenient, but you know, if you want to style on them with your heirloom, you gotta do what you gotta do. Tip number 7, close range fights is what you want to strive for. Medium range is good and all, but you need to focus on closing the gap if you're using a controller. This is where controller will be its strongest, and it's something every good controller player is doing. Now, don't get me confused, being effective at mid-range is super important and probably an overlooked aspect for a lot of controller players. But as a controller player, your bread and butter is up close. Aim assist will do its thing the most here, and honestly, in a game like Apex, you just flat out can't avoid close range engagements. It's just not possible. So, not only practicing on closing the gap, but also performing well in these up-close encounters will certainly improve you as a controller player. Any good controller player that you watch, just focus on how often they're facilitating closing the gap to their opponent. Oh, I'll give you one more bonus tip. Try to reload before you enter the death box. That way, when you press reload, it'll start the reload animation. Then you can press interact again and get into the death box and grab a quick armor swap if you need to. You don't want to get the armor swap and then have to reload if you're in the face of an enemy. So now you've learned about all these controller tips. Well, it won't do you any good if you don't pay attention to these 17 misconceptions that are constantly circulating throughout Apex. Check this video out next. Thanks for watching. Peace.